Hi, this is Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt of Congregation B'nai Tzedek in Potomac, Maryland, and I am offering now a Passover workshop called Why is This Night Different from All Other Passover Nights? And it's obviously the question that's on everybody's mind at this particular time because of the fact that it is so very different than other times. So tonight what I want to do is spend a little time together sharing you some insights with you about Passover, some things that hopefully maybe will give a little extra spice to your Passover Seder, and also provide some background and interesting insights into the holiday of Passover itself. When we tell the story, first of all, we're going to talk about telling the story. We're going to talk about why we tell the story, how we tell the story. I also am going to offer some creative, fun ideas to enhance your Passover Seder as well. So that's part of what I want to do tonight. And then on Thursday night, I'm going to continue the conversation also. If you are able to join us both nights, please do feel free to do so. So the main purpose of the Passover Seder is we have a Haggadah, and the word Haggadah means telling. So the purpose is to tell the story from one generation to the next. And as we do that, we have this book which is called the Haggadah. And in the Haggadah, it is contains materials from the Torah, from the Bible, from the Talmud, from the Midrash, from other texts as well. All these different periods of our history. And the purpose is for one generation to tell the next. One of the things I think we're going to find that's so interesting this year is that there are, and I've often found this to be the case, that there are rituals that we perform and suddenly we find new meaning in them. By way of example, every year before we actually eat, we have the custom of orchatz, of the washing of our hands. Needless to say, this year when we do it, we're going to be thinking very, very differently about why it is that we wash our hands and what that actually means. So with the purpose of the story, I just want to try and say that Passover is the central story. It's the central story of the Jewish people. It tells our birth, the birth of a Jewish people, as a people. It's the story that's found, of course, in the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is the second book of the Bible. The book of Genesis tells how we became a family. And then in the book of Exodus, it tells how we become a people. So we go from being Bnei Yaakov, the children of Jacob, to becoming Bnei Yisrael, the people of Israel. And so our birth story is very unique. I don't know if you've ever thought about this or not, but most ancient peoples, when they would tell their stories, they would talk about the fact that they came from royalty, or they would talk about their background. But here, what we are specifically commanded to do is to say that we started from nothing. The Yiddish term would be gornisht. We started from gornisht, and we go from there. And so it is a remarkable story in the fact that we are so spread out across the world as Jews. We are from as far away as Yemen and Poland and Russia and Afghanistan, Germany and Morocco. And yet we have this story which binds us together. We speak different languages. The question I'd like to ask is, what is it that unites us? What is it that holds this amazing people together throughout the ages, spread out all across the world, who should have ended a long, long time ago, and yet somehow we're still here? Well, part of it is perhaps that we tell our story. Part of it is our customs, our calendar that unites us, the mitzvot that we perform. The Torah, anti-Semitism plays a role as well. And so it is that with this, we are united as a people. Let me share with you something and that I found to be interesting. It's by a sage. I don't know if you ever heard of his name before or not. His name is Saadia Gaon, in the 10th century in Babylonia. And this is what he wrote. He said the following, quote, "Since our Israelite nation is a nation only by virtue of Torah, and the Creator said that this nation would endure like heaven and earth, then most certainly the Torah will endure like the heaven and the earth." So when I ask that question, what is it that binds us together? I see Deborah Altman answered, and you can feel free to interact or to respond to some of these things as well. She writes traditions. And that's what this night is all about. Passing the traditions from one to the next and the message of the Torah, which is our link to our past, it's our link to our future, and if you think about it, it's our link to each other. A Jew is a Jew because he or she has been called upon by God and is part of a covenantal people. And that's why even a person who is born Jewish as well as someone who chooses to become Jewish all share this in common. So imagine the power of thinking of ourselves as God's emissaries, spreading Torah, praying, studying, acting. And so with that, let's turn now to what happens during the Passover Seder itself, and let's talk a little bit about what happens beforehand. First of all, what should everybody be doing right now? Anybody who's on the call can feel free to answer the question by writing a comment in there, and that is, what is it that we do before the holiday? You have to get ready for it. And so right now is the time to begin the whole process of cleaning your home. I love telling this especially to kids and to parents with kids, and that is that you have to get rid of the chametz, which means going through all of your drawers and the breadcrumbs. Don't forget about your car, because most people, we have a little snack in the car on our way to work, if anyone remembers what it means to go to work. We begin the holiday then by preparing for it. And then as we build up to it, we also prepare by getting rid of the chametz in our homes, which is in addition to a thorough spring cleaning and stuff like that. It's in our homes as well, so that we are preparing there. The night before, and I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow night, on Thursday night, we do something which is called bidikat chametz. And that is where we look for the chametz. It's a bit of a tradition which is kind of like a combination in certain respects of looking for a treasure hunt that we go on. And we're looking in order to be able to find what we can that might be chametz. And I'll talk more about that next time. But I want to talk about the this aspect of Passover and it being so unique. Some of you may know the story about the fact that a number of years ago, the chief rabbi of England had received word that in honor of all of his charitable and philanthropic work, the Queen of England decided that she was going to make him a knight. And so it is that when he got to the ceremony in the palace, along with all the others who were being knighted that day, he realized, and he was actually didn't know what to do, because he was supposed to say something in Latin from the Christian liturgy during the ceremony. When it came his turn, after everyone else had been knighted, he didn't know any of the Latin. He didn't know what to say, and the queen was obviously waiting for him to say something. At which point, the words that came out of his mouth was "Manishtana halayla hazeh." At which point, the queen turned to her husband, Prince Philip, and said, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" I need a laugh track here, but at any rate. But seriously, folks, the point is that this night is different, and this Passover will be different than other nights. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that we have that are gathered around the number 4. Think about it. How many things are there that happen on the Passover Seder that revolve around the number 4? We have the 4 questions. We have the 4 sons or the 4 children. There are 4 cups of wine. And so this number 4 is central. And I want to just spend a moment explaining why there are so many 4s in the Passover Seder. Well, first of all, the reason that we have 4 children is because of the fact that there are 4 different times that we are told, "You shall tell your child of what it is that God did for me when we came out of the land of Egypt." And so 4 different times God specifically says to Moses, be sure you let others know and that you speak to them and you say to them all of these specific wonders that were done for us. How about the 4 cups of wine? Well, the reason we have 4 cups of wine, and you read in the book of Exodus, there are 4 different verbs that are used to say that God saved us out of Egypt. One is, he says, I took you, I brought you, I saved you, and I redeemed you. And so with that then, each one of the cups of wine represents and reminds us of that. And finally, the 4 questions. What are the 4 questions really all about? Why do we have 4 questions? And by the way, if you notice, in most Haggadahs, we don't really even answer the 4 questions directly. So I think there are a couple of messages that I want to share with you here. And their message is important to share around your Seder table this year as well. One, that sometimes the asking of the question is more important than the answers that we actually give. In Judaism, we want to always encourage people to ask questions, to feel free to wonder. And that's one of the reasons why we have the 4 questions. Secondly, we have 4 questions because to remind us that there are 4 different kinds, 4 different ways to explore 4 different aspects of the holiday itself. And when we have the parallel of the 4 children, each one of them asking the question differently, each one of them raising a different issue. Perhaps one of the points then is that each one of them represents a different kind of learner, or that each one of them represents something different in each of us. So one of the things that I wanted to suggest is with the 4 questions, maybe, and feel free to jot this down, I'm going to give you a suggestion now, that we take the original ones and maybe come up with 4 questions of your own. Or ask your children, each one of them, to come up with a different question. And let me just share with you a few that I was playing around with. One question could be, on all other Passover nights, our table is filled with guests. Our home is open, but tonight it is just us. Number 2, and then you can fill in whatever that question may be. What can we learn from this, or why is that the case, or whatever? Number 2, on all other nights, we gather together with family. Tonight, we are gathered with our family via the internet. How does this technology help to keep us connected? And how can technology be harmful? And that might be a great question as well to ask. Number 3, on all other nights, we say we were slaves, and now we are free. How is it that this year we are slaves? How is it that we are not yet free? What is it like to be confined to our homes? And a 4th question, on all other night, we speak about what happened primarily to our people. Tonight, we recognize not just what happened to our people, but how can we relate to what is happening to other people around the world as well. So those were just a couple of questions that I came up with to help to suggest that maybe you can ask them after the traditional 4 questions, after having the opportunity to do the traditional chanting. Something else, another thing I wanted to throw out there and to suggest. When we talk this year about the plagues, we talk about what do we do? As I'm sure most of you know, we take a cup of wine and we either dip. Some people are dippers with their fingers. Some people are dippers like this. But the point is, as so many of you I'm sure know, the reason we do that is to lessen our cup of joy because of the fact that even though we were freed from Egyptian slavery, nevertheless, it came at the expense of those Egyptian lives who, although they were our oppressors, still were creatures of God. And so we take our cup of wine and we diminish it slightly. And when we do that, we're reciting each of the plagues. Well, obviously, there certainly is a plague that we can all add this year that many of us will be thinking about. And that is, of course, the plague of the COVID-19 virus, of coronavirus. And so it lends itself to a discussion. In what way is this a plague? In what way is it different from other plagues? When will it end? How will it end? What can we learn from this? And so on. One of the key things about Passover is, and if I were to ask you, what are some of your favorite passages and messages about Passover? One of the things I want to say is that for me, and actually if people would like to comment, I'd love to see, the question is, what is your favorite part of the Passover Seder? When I ask kids that, they always answer, how you can imagine what they answer, the meal. But other than the meal and the matzah ball soup and things like that, is there a passage in the Passover Seder that you particularly like? Please, if you would just take a moment and feel free to comment, and then I'll share some of the responses. But I'm going to, while I'm waiting for responses to that question of what is it that you may particularly like, what passage, what words resonate for you every year. One of the things that I think that I want to mention that is so important is we are told to add to the story, to enhance it. And what that means is that it's a time of questions, a time of interaction, a time of embellishment, a time in which we're also supposed to feel as if we ourselves were in Egypt, as if we ourselves had been freed from slavery. And so that's an aspect of it that I want to say is central to the story. So in order to put ourselves into the story and to think about the Passover, I want to suggest one or two other things that it may be a little bit different, a little bit unusual, but to take advantage of the interactive fact that so many of us are going to be doing Passover via Zoom this year. I just wonder, by the way, whether or not Zoom has a capacity to handle all the Seders it's going to handle next Wednesday night. You know, one of the things I always find so fascinating, and it happens almost every year, is the day after Yom Kippur and or the day after Rosh Hashanah, when I'm listening to the morning news and it will talk about the stock market the previous day, it almost always will say trading was light yesterday on the New York Stock Exchange due to the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, whatever it may be. And I'm thinking, do they know what we're talking about? We're talking about less than approximately 2% of the entire population of the United States, less than 1/10 or 100th of a percent of the population of the entire world, and it has that much of an impact. So anyway, but it's probably best not to talk about the stock market this year altogether anyway. But the point I wanted to make is that when we are involved and we're connected via Zoom, still, how do we make our Seders interesting? How do we make it interactive? So I'm going to throw out another suggestion now, and that is one of the things that can be done, and if it doesn't work this year, you can save it for next year, is to assign someone the part of Pharaoh. And then when you're telling the story, to ask Pharaoh any of a number of different questions. You could be a reporter and be holding a microphone to ask the Pharaoh questions, and you should pick what time period. So let me share with you some questions that I came up with if Pharaoh were to visit my Passover Seder. Pharaoh, could you please tell us why is it that you are so reluctant to let the Hebrews go? And perhaps you could start with a question like that, and then follow up with that. Another question for the Pharaoh. Could you tell us a little something about the behind the scenes, the negotiations that went on between you and Moses? How did you feel about those negotiations, and what is your relationship with Moses? After all, he grew up in your palace, and now he's confronting you. Another question you could ask the Pharaoh is, tell us, do you really think this whole slavery thing is sustainable as an economic system? Another one. Are you concerned about the plagues which seem to be plaguing your people? And not only that, but how are the people responding to them? What do you tell the people about this? And maybe even just take one of the plagues. You know, we see there's a lot of cattle that have died recently. How do you explain that? And, how do you feel about that? Perhaps you could follow up with another question. Are you at all worried about this guy Moses and his threats and the things that he's saying? Another question you can ask is to the Pharaoh is perhaps maybe after they've left, how are you feeling now? Or something like that. So at any rate, one of the points, again, as I'm trying to say, is to bring the story alive, to put yourself in the story. We are told that we are to feel, as I said, as if each and every one of us was a part of the Passover story, as though each and every one of us actually was in Egypt and that we were freed. We put ourselves into the story. When we talk about I talked a little bit about the 4 questions, and wanted to mention something about the 4 children, and that is, what can we say to the wise child to make them want to know even more? Another question we could ask, what could we say to the simple child so that they will understand more? What can we say to the shy children so they'll be able to ask questions. And then, of course, to the wicked child. What is it that makes the wicked child wicked? And it is, of course, the fact that they take themselves out of the picture. You know, when they say, what is it that God did for you and not for me? And the answer is, if this kid would have been in Egypt, you wouldn't have even been able to be saved. Is that an appropriate answer or not? Maybe you have a different answer. So the idea is to take the text, expand it, and play with it. Understand the aspects of how it is meant to tell us, for us to tell our story, our master story, our narrative of who we are, how we became who we are, and what it is that we do. You know, when we look at this aspect of the Passover Seder, it has, the word Seder itself means it has an order. And because of the fact that it has an order, that's one of the other things that you can do for children. And that is to take the list of the parts of the Seder, maybe you have them have a paper clip on the side, and then move it along as we're moving through the parts of the Seder. Another question, by the way, another suggestion to bring your Seder alive a little bit, is to have an interview perhaps with Moses. I talked about interviewing Pharaoh. Well, you could also interview Moses. Moses, can you tell us, please, how do you feel about the fact that you aren't mentioned in the Haggadah? Do you feel that maybe, you should have gotten a little more press? Why is it that you weren't mentioned? Should you have had a better PR agent? Another question perhaps for Moses. There are several times when the Pharaoh has said to you, okay, you can go after one of the plagues. And then he changes his mind and he says, no, come on back. And he doesn't allow the people to go. When that last one occurred, did you have any doubts about that? Were there any perhaps mixed feelings that you were worried that he was going to come after you, which of course, as we know, he ultimately does. Moving from some of these aspects, I want to share the theme of Passover, of course, has to do with this notion of being redeemed, that we start off very low, and then by the end of the Seder, we become free. In fact, at the beginning of the Seder, we say, now we are slaves, next year we will be free. Well, that certainly is more true this year perhaps than ever. That opening paragraph of the Seder. And we also say, what else do we say in that opening paragraph? We also say, let anyone who is hungry come in to eat. We can't do that this year. We can't just open our doors. We can't invite everyone. Actually, I'm kind of wondering and a little worried about Elijah going from house to house. But hopefully he's going to, he'll be covered. And he will have his hand sanitizer with him as he goes from one house to the next. And that might be another question you can ask, by the way. When you open the door for Elijah, what precautions is Elijah taking this year? And how can we be sure that Elijah isn't spreading the coronavirus from one house to the next when he's going from one place to the next? Anyway, just the point is to have fun and to tell the story in a way which brings new meaning to it. And so when we open with that section in which we say that this year we are slaves, next year we will be free, it is so very true this year. The Seder is a dialogue. It's a dialogue between the people who are at the table, the people who are in our family or on our Zoom calls, and it's also a dialogue across the generations. It goes and takes us back to the generations who came before us. The dialogue takes us to across continents, and as I said before, it's one of the things that unites us so much as a people. I remember in the 1960s when I was growing up, and we would read the Passover Haggadah in my family, and we would talk about the story of being redeemed from slavery to freedom, and our obligation as Jews to remember that we were once slaves, to remember that we were once strangers in the land of Egypt, and what does that mean for us today, and our obligation, therefore, to feel the pain of others, our obligation, therefore, to work on behalf of freedom for others, not just for ourselves. And so in the 60s in particular, a time of the great civil rights movements raging, we had some unbelievable family discussions. I had two uncles in particular, actually, who were, let's just say, very, very much on the conservative side in regard to the whole aspect of civil rights. And then there were those of us who were very strong advocates of equal rights and of civil rights and of the civil rights movement and so on. And so the words of the Passover Seder really came alive. And then in the 1970s, the words of the Passover Seder came so much alive during the time of the Soviet Jewry movement, when many of us were working and feeling and hoping to be able to see the time when Soviet Jews would be free. And ultimately, of course, that did happen. And so it is that this year we take that message of what it is that's happening in the world, and that's part of the power of it. That is part of the power of Passover and of the whole message and of what it's all about, which is that it links us, as I said, to our past. It's this ongoing dialogue between what's happening in our world through the filter of Torah and of Judaism, and also of our connection to Jews around the world. Let me share this quote from, I think, everybody's favorite rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of England, who said the following, and I quote, feel free to jot this down if you want, I'll read it slowly. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says the following, to be a Jew is to join the journey of our people. The story of Pesach and the long walk across centuries and continents from exile to homecoming. I'll read it one more time. To be a Jew is to join the journey of our people, the story of Pesach, and the long walk across centuries and continents from exile to homecoming. There is no story like it. And then he concludes, and the journey is not yet complete. Again, there is no story like it. There's no story like ours, and the journey is not yet complete. I like to add, the story is not yet complete, that you are completing it, that we are completing it, that we add to it. And so in that context, I want to just say that when we conclude the Passover Seder, we conclude it with the words, next year in Jerusalem. And I was thinking about the fact that Passover is devoted so much to the concept of remembering, so much to the concept of telling our story. By the way, in Judaism, or in Hebrew rather, there's no real word for history. The closest, when they want to say history in Hebrew, you say historia. And historia, roughly translated, means history. But rather, the real word that we use, the words we use are toldot, which means generations. Elu toldot, these are the generations of our people. Or we use the word zachor, to remember. And that's what we're commanded to do. And so I find it so interesting that we conclude a night which is committed to remembering the past. And we emphasize telling the story of who we are, of where we came from, and of how we began. And we end that story, which emphasizes all of that, with the words, B'shana haba'a b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And so I think it's very interesting that we end with a proclamation of hope, a statement of faith, and a statement of looking to the future. Here, this night, which is immersed in the past, nevertheless looks to the future. So the last thing I want to say to conclude our discussion tonight, and we're going to have one, as I say, next in 2 nights on Thursday night. And I'm toying around with doing that one via Zoom rather than Facebook. So please feel free to double check the link to make sure you have the right one so that we can participate and join together. I just want to conclude with a fascinating story, and I'll be sharing other tips for making your Seders lively and other aspects of the meaning of Passover. I'll talk a little bit more about matzah, what it means. I'll talk a little bit more and show you how to actually do the bidikat chametz, the looking for chametz. And if anyone has anything you want me to address specifically between now and then, feel free to send me an email or a comment or whatever, and I'll do my best to try and include and incorporate as much of that as I can in the next sessions that we have. But I want to just share this because I've talked tonight about the importance of making the story relevant, making the story yours, making it come alive. I want to go back to what I said at the very beginning, and that is that part of the power excuse me, part of the power of ritual is that we say things over and over, and then they can suddenly take on meaning that they otherwise may not have had. And that's part of the filter of the conversation between the generations, and one of the reasons why, for 2,000 years, this wonderful custom has continued to exist. In other words, that we take the old and we take the new and we combine it together. So I want to just offer a cautionary note, and that is it's important not to throw out all of the traditions and not to make something so relevant that it has little connection to what it is that those who came before us did. There's a fascinating story that's told, and it's told by Rabbi Shlomo Riskin. He talks about the fact that he was at a dinner with Golda Meir, who was honored at the time by the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations. And it just so happens that she was given a presentation. The presentation was of a modern interpretation of the Haggadah. And it was given to her, and she looked at the Haggadah, and then, being the Israeli that she was, although she grew up in America, was born in Russia, she was the prime minister of Israel. She looked at the Haggadah, and after a few moments, just put it aside. And she said, "Thank you very much, but I really am not so interested, and I'm not so crazy about this Haggadah." So the person who gave it to her was shocked. Not only by the way in which she responded so frankly, but the person said, "Madam Prime Minister, I'm surprised to hear you say this. I know that you are not Orthodox, that you're not an Orthodox Jew. And this Haggadah that I'm giving you brings the whole story up to date. In fact, it even goes and talks about the modern day state of Israel." And this is how Golda Meir replied. She said, "It's true. I am not an Orthodox Jew. I'm not a traditional Jew, and I never will be one. But I want you to know I do make a Passover Seder. And I do it each and every year for myself, for my children, but I especially do it for my grandchildren. And what is most important to me is that my granddaughter will say at my Seder the same words that my grandmother said at her Seder." And so I want to conclude our session tonight with that message, which is embellish the story, add to the story. Ask new questions, ask more questions. Talk about the coronavirus, talk about the 11th plague, or whatever it is you want to do, or take any of the things that I mentioned tonight about interviewing Pharaoh or Moses, or changing the questions, but don't get so far afield from our text that the next year it won't have meaning to anyone. And to make sure that we have that connection, each and every one of us, each and every year, and that's one of the things that binds us together as we share our story and our traditions. So with that, I wish everyone a Laila Tov, a Zis Pesach, and as I said, on Thursday night, also at 8:15, for about a half hour, I'm going to be offering part 2 of the Passover workshop that and I welcome your questions, your comments. And also tomorrow night I'll be appearing one more time on Facebook Live with a message to our congregation, but also open to anyone and to everyone. Feel free to share this and to share other wonderful suggestions for Passover. And I wish everyone a Chag Sameach, and may you have a good time preparing for the holiday as well. Thank you.